Continuing with Chapter 2 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. In our last session, we had just read about how during his first term, Nixon had worked around his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, by going often to Kissinger's deputy, Alexander Haig, without Kissinger's knowledge, without letting Haig work independently of Kissinger often. And now Haig was going to be was becoming Nixon's chief of staff after the resignation of Bob Haldeman, and then Fred Bizart, who Haig is bringing on as the counsel to the president on Watergate, talked about how much of Bizart's knowledge from Nixon had come from his ex-boss at the Pentagon, former Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, whose main point that bothered Bizart was that Nixon liked to keep people off balance, never gave anyone the full story. That way, if anybody tried to argue with him, he could say, well, you don't know the whole picture. I'm the only one that knows everything here. So Bizart had his reservations, but Bizart, as Woodward and Bernstein write here, Bizart was committed now, just as Haig was, and he would serve and do his best. The biggest problem here is credibility, Haig told him. The president's new team would meet matters head on. They would launch a counteroffensive. Bizart was pleased. Throughout Watergate, he firmly believed Nixon's mistake had been a failure to move off the defensive, to seize the issues and shake them to death. Bizart and Haig wanted finally to get ahead of the problem, meet the current charges, anticipate future ones, answer them all. Right now. The barrage of half-truths and speculation was devastating. The general and the lawyer went to the president. Haig did the talking. A final and definitive statement that dealt with the major allegations, both direct and implied, should be drafted, he said. It would have to stand for all time. It was essential that the statement be consistent with anything that might surface. The president said he was willing to let them give it a try. This would be the new team's first major effort, but they couldn't do it alone. They needed the members of the old White House team, who might have some information and some influence with the president. That would include Leonard Garment. It would be good to have the House liberal in on this. And Nixon's two principal speechwriters, Raymond K. Price, Jr. and Patrick J. Buchanan, who were regarded by the president as, respectively, the heart and soul of his administration. Price, a 43-year-old Yale graduate who had worked for Collier's Magazine, Life, and the New York Herald Tribune, was the idealist and gentle theoretician. Buchanan, 35, a conservative former editorial writer for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, who had signed up with Nixon in 1966, was the hard political realist, the gut fighter, the resident expert in media manipulation. Time was short, Bizart knew. The Senate Watergate Committee's hearings were scheduled to begin on May 17th. 4 separate matters had to be met head-on, and reasons found to explain the president's actions. A rationale had to be offered for 1. The approval of the Houston Plan authorizing illegal intelligence gathering, 2. The wiretapping of administration aides and of reporters, 3. The directive to the CIA to keep the FBI from investigating the Mexican money connection as stated in the Walters Memcon, 4. The presence of the Plumbers Unit in the White House. E. Howard Hunt, Jr., a former CIA agent, and G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent, both convicted in the Watergate case, had been plumbers. Their role in the Ellsberg break-in had also to be explained. The president was not very cooperative. Bizart and the others discovered very quickly. He did not wish to sit down with Haig or Bizart or anybody else and offer his version of events. He told Bizart to draft the best defense he could and bring it back for review. The process was excruciating. Slowly, Bizart started piecing something together. Though the president always seemed ready, even eager, to review his lawyer's work, he never volunteered anything to Bizart. never offered to tell him what had actually happened. Bizart would bring a set of postulates to him, and the president would respond, "That's wrong, try it again." Hide and seek. Bizart wanted to wrap up the wiretaps, the plumbers, and the Walters Memcons in a national security blanket. Approval of the Houston plan would be acknowledged and would be cast as a response to a wave of violence, arson, and bombing in the cities and on the campuses in 1970. Bizart and Garment were reasonably certain that the president had authorized the Ellsberg break-in, even though he still denied it. Bizart thought they might yet dredge up legitimate national security grounds, but the others resisted the idea of even suggesting that the president had approved the break-in. If they dared take such a suggestion to Nixon, he would certainly fly into a rage. Bizart persisted, though, and wrote it into a draft which admitted that Nixon had authorized the break-in for national security reasons, justified by the dangers that release of the Pentagon Papers posed to the president's efforts to bring peace in Vietnam with honor. The admission had a bold and confessional quality. It recalled to Bizart the way President Kennedy had absorbed the responsibility for the Bay of Pigs invasion. I was interrupted there, so let me just go back a sentence or so, make sure that I get everything in here. The admission had a bold and confessional quality. It recalled to Bizart the way President Kennedy had absorbed the responsibility for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Everyone else was sure Bizart wouldn't dare take the draft to the president, but he did. The president read it. "I like the theory," he said calmly, "but the thing is that I didn't do it." Bizart cut out that part of the draft. Now the group turned to Walters' memcons about the June 23rd conversation and about other discussions that had taken place at the White House in the week following the Watergate break-in. Buchanan searched the memos for any hint, any veiled reference about national security. He couldn't find one. Buchanan had never maintained in private that the president was nearly so ignorant of the cover-up as he claimed, but it was the job of the prosecutors to prove otherwise, not his own, Buchanan reasoned. Still, this matter was especially troubling. The Walters memcons were not the kind of thing to trifle with. "Walters is a goddamn memory expert, for Christ's sake," Buchanan exploded. "He can listen to a guy talk for 10 minutes and then give it back word for word in French." Price was also skeptical. He could see how Nixon might have thought then and now that national security was at stake when in fact it wasn't, strictly speaking. The president had always discussed the Watergate revelations with Price in the context of his own national security responsibilities. Bizart was disturbed. He went back to the president. "National security," Nixon reiterated. "Where? How? What?" The president didn't respond directly. National security was sufficient. It had to do. He instructed Bizart to make the statement broad. Bizart and Buchanan drafted another paragraph, which Nixon finally accepted. Quote, "It seemed to me possible that because of the involvement of former CIA personnel in the Watergate break-in, and because of some of their apparent associations, this investigation could lead to the uncovering of covert CIA operations totally unrelated to the Watergate break-in." End quote. Bizart then asked the president for some particulars. The president wouldn't deal with the question, but he insisted on one point. With the exception of the Ellsberg break-in, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy's work for the plumbers had been undertaken for legitimate purposes of national security. Slowly, Bizart and Buchanan elicited what they felt had been Nixon's state of mind at the time. With the aid of Garment and Price, they fashioned another paragraph in the president's name. Quote, "I wanted justice done with regard to Watergate, but in the scale of national priorities with which I had to deal, and not at that time having any idea of the extent of political abuse which Watergate reflected, I also had to be deeply concerned with ensuring that neither the covert operations of the CIA nor the operations of the Special Investigations Unit, plumbers, should be compromised. Therefore, I instructed Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman to see that this was personally coordinated between General Walters, the Deputy Director of the CIA, and Mr. Gray of the FBI. It was certainly not my intent nor my wish that the investigation of the Watergate break-in or of related acts be impeded in any way." End quote. Buchanan was not convinced and insisted that Bizart ask the president once more whether there had been any political considerations. It was the 6th time he had gone back. National security. There could be no mistake, the president said. Okay. Bizart returned to Buchanan. That's what the man says, Pat. On May 22nd, a 4,000-word presidential statement was released to the press. Garment and Bizart were assigned to appear to answer reporters' questions. The press corps became abusive and incessantly interrupted the two lawyers as they tried to answer. Garment was offended by the scene. It affronted his sense of refinement of what was civilized, courteous behavior. Even so, the reporters' questions were not very different from those that Bizart had continually carried back to the president. When? Why? How? What reasons were there to believe that this statement would not be rendered as inoperative as all the others? Garment could only reply that neither the president nor the president's lawyers could know precisely what he had been told, and precisely when he had been told it. The president had searched his mind and his notes. There is no fundamental difference between the situation of the president and any other individual who has to deal with problems of recollection of events and transactions many months removed, Garment explained. Garment left the briefing convinced that the 4,000-word statement was a disaster, not because anything was held back, but because the president had admitted to so much: questionable wiretapping, a domestic intelligence plan that to Garment's mind was Hitlerian, the plumbers, a term and concept that should have come from a Broadway comedy, not the White House, and an obstruction of the early Watergate FBI probe for reasons steeped in mystery and in unconvincing claims of national security. A week passed during which Garment was surprised that there was no call for impeachment. He could not comprehend the mildness of the reaction. Was the country so unaccustomed to candor from the White House that a reckless assertion of the truth, no matter how squalid, was welcomed for its openness rather than condemned for its content? Buchanan, for one, was now certain that the president could get away with almost anything. It was important now to dispose of the matter, to get Watergate behind them, to move on, he said. Bizart was content. This statement would never have to be declared inoperative. Now it seemed that Watergate might soon be over, and Bizart could get back to the Defense Department, where he retained his title as General Counsel. And I'm going to stop here for just a moment. So this is the second time, I think, that Woodward and Bernstein have used the term inoperative in connection with one of the a statement that had been issued by the White House. This was Ron Ziegler's term as press secretary, and he was mocked by some Nixon opponents, for that, because they would something would be put out. He would say one thing one day at a press conference, and then the next day he would say, "Oh, well, that's what I told you yesterday. That's now inoperative." Doesn't say it. He wouldn't say it's a lie. He wouldn't say it's false. He'd just say it's inoperative. So that's what they're saying here. When they say this statement would never have to be declared inoperative, that's referring to other statements that have been declared inoperative by Ziegler and the White House. "God damn the Washington Post," Ziegler shouted when the newspaper's Sunday edition of June 3rd was dropped on his desk. The lead story was headlined, "Dean alleges Nixon knew of cover-up plan." It stated that Dean planned to, quote, testify under oath at the Senate's Watergate hearings, regardless of whether he is granted full immunity from prosecution, and he will allege that President Nixon was deeply involved in the cover-up, end quote. Dean intended to swear that he was present or received telephone calls, quote, on at least 35 occasions between January and April 1973, in which the cover-up was discussed with the president, the story said. All this was attributed as usual to, quote, reliable sources. Ziegler was sure that meant Dean and his lawyers. Dean's testimony, the article stated, would claim that the president had advanced knowledge of the executive clemency offers and of payments of hush money to the Watergate conspirators. "Impossible, absolutely impossible," Ziegler shouted at Judy Johnson and Diane Sawyer, two of his principal assistants. "All right, go back and see why the president was meeting with Dean." It was a tedious assignment, An enormous number of lists of meetings and phone calls had to be retrieved from the White House Archives Office. No detailed records of the subjects of conversations between the president and his aides have been kept, so the meetings had to be approximately reconstructed through newspaper clippings from copies of the White House news summaries that Buchanan's office prepared daily, and from handwritten notes that the president sometimes passed on to Haldeman or Ziegler. The record, pitifully incomplete, was assembled in a 3-ring binder for Ziegler. It was Dean versus the president. At Camp David, Maryland, the presidential retreat that Dwight Eisenhower had named after his grandson, Nixon read the newspapers that Sunday and found much to distress him. The Post was reporting, quote, "One of the strongest charges against Mr. Nixon that Dean has made to investigators refers to a meeting Dean said he had with Mr. Nixon shortly before the sentencing of the 7 Watergate defendants, March 23rd. Dean said that Mr. Nixon asked him how much the defendants would have to be paid to ensure their continued silence. Dean, the sources reported, maintains that he told Mr. Nixon the additional cost would be about $1 million, and Dean also claims that the president replied there would be no problem in paying that amount," end quote. The New York Times, also citing anonymous informants, said that one of its sources, quote, "suggested that Mr. Dean may have tape recorded some of his White House conversations during the January through April period in the White House. Everybody taped everybody else then," the source said. "Dean did it himself," end quote. Before he left Camp David that afternoon, the president called Haldeman 3 times. At 4:18 p.m., his former chief of staff arrived at the White House to meet him. Haldeman stayed for nearly 2 hours. It was the 32nd time that the president and Haldeman had talked in the 5 weeks since Haldeman had resigned. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 2. We will take up next time, in our next session, with Chapter 3 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.